What's up everybody, welcome back to this week's video, and you've probably clicked on this video because you do not enjoy the process of hand binding. Now today I'm going to show you how amazing machine binding is and how much faster it is. Let's get started. So we're going to break this down into essentially three different parts to the video. Part number one is how do we measure our quilt top and make sure we have enough fabric to do our binding. Part number two is how you make your binding. Part number three is how you machine bind it. So let's jump into the actual math of the project. So this quilt is a smaller quilt. It makes it easier for the video. And this quilt is 43 inches by 50 inches. A pretty easy size to work with. Now, to understand how much we need, we have to have enough fabric to cover all four sides. What I like to do is start off with the easiest number of the group here, which is 50. So I have 50 on one side, 50 on the other side, which equals 100. Then I have 43 with 43 on the other side, which will be 86, which is a total of 186 inches all the way around. Grab out your calculator if you need it, but that's how much I need for the bare minimum to bind this project. From there, go ahead and add an extra foot onto that. That will give you enough wiggle room to make sure that you can complete your project no problems. With my math here, I'm at 198 inches, and that's including my 12-inch buffer there. From there, you're going to divide that number by 40 inches, which is the length of your fabric. And that will work for batiks, that will work for cotton. 40 is like the golden number to divide by. Now, if you end up with some strange number like 4.69 something, just round up to the nearest whole, which in my case will be 5 strips. All of the strips normally for a quilt binding are 2.5 inches wide. So at this point, how the math goes, we need 5 strips at 2.5 inches, which is which comes out to be about 3/8 of a yard. Again, in quilting, guys, a little extra never hurts to have. So you would want to round that up to maybe 1/2 of a yard just to give yourself that extra little cushion there. Now, if you have a larger project, obviously you'll need more fabric. If you have less or a smaller project, you'll need less fabric. Just make sure you're always adding that 12 inches and rounding up just a little bit more always. They will always guarantee you with enough fabric. And to have a little extra will never hurt you. So that is how you get the math for your fabric. But since I've got these beautiful purple tones here, then I think it's just fine to add some purple binding. To cut these, I'm going to just use a normal rotary cutter. And obviously I would normally just cut off 1/2 of a yard, but since I have the bolt here today, I'm going to just cut it straight off the bolt. Now, whenever you start your binding, you're going to want to cut a straight edge on this side. Normally, they're a little bit off or a little bit crooked, so just take the extra time, line it up, make sure it's nice and good, and this will save you so much hassle with your binding if you just make sure everything's straight to begin with. So, got my rotary cutter here. I'm going to cut this up. Now it's time to cut my 2.5 inch strips. So I'm going to use the numbers on my ruler here. I'm going to line them up at 2.5 inches and begin cutting. So what happens a lot is we start measuring like this, which will keep us cutting with our left hand. If we're not left hand dominant, that's a problem. So all you have to do, guys, is turn your fabric around. We know that that edge is straight. We have a really nice straight reference point. So I'm going to just spin the fabric all the way around, line it up with the lines on my cutting mat to make sure I stay super square. So I'm going to line up my 2.5 inch, and start cutting my strips. I need 5 of them to complete my project, so that's what I'll cut now. That's strip number 1, which will be strip number 2. Strip number 3. Strip number 4. And lastly, strip number 5. So I've got all my strips here laid out, and there's really 2 ways of connecting all your binding strips. I find one looks better or easier on the eye than the other, the easiest, fastest way to do it is all you're going to do is you're going to take right sides together. You're going to put them like this, and you're going to sew directly across that, which will give you straight sewn binding. It's completely acceptable to do it this way, but what happens is on your quilt itself, you'll be able to see that seam line very visibly here because it kind of breaks up, puts a dark spot in your actual binding. Then there's mitered binding, where it's more of on a diagonal angle, which is easier on the eye and it's less apparent when you're looking at the quilt, which is why I'm going to show you guys today. Now, to do this, I'm going to take two of my strips, I'm going to pull the other ones aside, and luckily, since I'm using solids today, it makes it really easy. There's not really a right or a wrong side, but you're going to put right sides together. And one of the easiest ways to remember how to do this is you kind of make it look like a pair of pants here. So I'm going to put them right sides together, like so. Now, it's probably a little bit hard to see on camera is I have this salvage edge on both ends of my strips here, and they have tiny little holes in them. We don't want that on our binding, so I've just moved it down and up away from those salvage edges there. So I've got kind of the legs of my pants here. What I want to do is sew directly across where the belt line would be from this end to this end here. Now, if you need to, make sure you grab it's over here. Make sure you grab yourself a pen, and you can simply just drop your ruler down, put a line all the way across it to show where your corner to corner will be. And guys, one more reason why we like to do mitered binding instead of just a straight edge binding is kind of the bulk of the project will kind of swirl around your quilt. As opposed to if you just do the straight version of it, then all the bulk or all that seam is going to be in one place. So it's a little bit more noticeable just due to that as well. So I've marked my line on there. I'm going to bring it over to my sewing machine, sew directly on my line, and then it should open up as beautiful binding strips. So on over to here, dropping down that pressure foot. And guys, you kind of get a knack for it eventually where you can just sew them without marking them, but take the time. It's good practice to just make sure it's perfect. So I've sewn directly across that, and when you open it up, they should line up absolutely perfectly with each other. And we're going to continue down that process with my other 3 strips. Now, something that's super important is that you can accidentally twist binding. So you see how I've sewn it like this and it's laying down really, really flat? If I'm not sewing on the same side every single time, this is why having right sides together makes it a lot easier, is that I can sew this on and sew it onto the back side of this, and then you'll have to unpick something. So make sure you're doing it onto the right sides. Bring it up, make my pair of pants. Just like so. Grab my ruler. You're going to put that really nice mark there. And something about binding is it's the last thing, right? And so a lot of people want to rush it. There's no need to rush it. You want to make sure your quilt at the very last stretch looks perfect. So, And I'm going to continue down, making sure I don't make a mistake on this. And we're going to continue on through here. Now we're going into the last strip here. So now that I've got all my strips sewn together, let me show you how you cut these strips to make sure they end up being nice and flat. As you can see, I've got my seam line here, my fabrics just like so. I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to drop it down, and right on the 1/4 inch mark here, I'm going to put that right on top of my seam, and then I'm going to cut this all the way down, which will get rid of all my excess on top of making sure I have a perfect 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to just continue repeating this all the way down the entirety of my strip here to ensure that everything looks exactly as it should. So now that I have my strips here sewn up and cleaned up, I've gotten rid of all the excess, it's now time to iron these. Now, what I like to do personally is I open up my seams. I'll show you that right now. What I personally like to do is I like to pull out my iron, make sure that's all hot, and I'm going to just slip it right into this seam and open the seam. Jeez, that was too hard. I'm going to iron open this seam here. It'll help everything just lay perfectly flat. So now that I have my binding all made up here, and I've already opened up my seams here, it's now time to do the fold to the binding. What we need to do is find whichever side our little seam here is on, and we're gonna have to fold that over itself, just like so. And we're gonna iron this all the way down the length of our material here. That way we can hide all of our raw edges on the inside of the binding. So let's come on over here to the ironing board. And it's pretty simple. We're going to just fold it over itself and give it a really nice press. It's always the hardest to start. Once you have a crease into it, it kind of wants to fold the rest of the way. So not too hard to do, it just takes a little bit of time. That right there is my first strip. We're going to just continue on ironing all the way down the length of this. So guys, once you've ironed it, you should end up with a strip looking just like this. Now, there's a lot of different tips and tricks on how to deal with the mess here. A lot of people like roll it up on a piece of cardboard. A lot of times I just leave it as is and I kind of work with it. So now that I have this, I'm going to put this aside. And now it's time to grab our quilt. So unlike a normal hand binding, which you would sew to the front of your quilt and flip to the back, machine binding is the exact opposite. We're gonna be sewing our binding strips to the back side of this quilt. So it's time to turn it over and start on our binding. Now, a couple of little tips here. Do not start your binding on the corner of your project. Go probably 1/3 the way down from the corner. That's where I like to start. So I'm gonna grab my strip here, I'm gonna lay it roughly 1/3 the way down from my quilt, from the top of my quilt. And you're going to want to leave about 5 to 6 inches open that isn't sewn when you start your strip. So I'm gonna start mine roughly right here. I'm gonna just put a little mark on it, leaving this whole piece here loose. That way I can attach my other end to it at a later point. And guys, just so you guys can see, I'm gonna throw a clip on here where I'm gonna start sewing. So as far as sewing this on, you're gonna use a traditional 1/4 inch foot or a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Now, when we get to the corner, things can get a little tricky, so I'm gonna start sewing and we'll show you the corners here. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that my raw edge side is facing or on top of the raw edge side of my quilt, and my pretty side is on the opposite side, or on my left side in this case. Dropping my presser foot, I'm going to sew all the way down. I'm going to use a little bit more of a contrasting thread here. I would recommend that if you're going to do something like this, you'll be using purple thread because it matches the binding real good. I'm going to be using a light gray thread. It'll help show you on both sides. So let's just get started here. Something really important too is don't forget that back stitch while we're starting. You don't need to do a crazy back stitch, just 1 or 2 stitches is great. So got my back stitch done. Again guys, this is finished work that we're doing. So you want to take your time, make sure it's put on correctly. So, I'm gonna start sewing. Readjust and continue on sewing. Binding has a tendency of stretching. Don't let it stretch. Just kind of move with it, let the machine do its job. And I'm kind of just pulling out and unraveling it as I go here. So now that I'm 1/4 inch away from the edge of my quilt, I've hit this corner section, I'm going to stop 1/4 inch away. You can grab a ruler and put a mark there. Some feet have a 1/4 inch mark at the toe of the foot. Lots of different ways to do that, but I stop 1/4 inch away. From here, I'm going to lift up my presser foot. I'm going to turn my entire project like so, and I'm going to sew all the way up towards the point of my project. And I'll pull it out here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So I've sewn to the very tippy point of my project. Here I would normally leave it, but I'm going to pull it out. That way you guys can see it at home. So I've kind of veered up here. And if I leave my needle down, I can continue on my binding, but get this a really, really nice clean point. So at this point, what you do is you bring your binding up towards the top, and then right back down, just like so. Then let me show you that again. So what you do is, I've got my line here, my stitch line here. You're going to bring the material up towards your stitch line, making a 45-degree angle, lining up with the point of your quilt, and then you're going to bring it right back down on top of itself, just like so. Now, if I would have kept my needle in place, I can do all of this while I'm sitting on the machine, so I never have to take out my stitches or my needle. So I'm going to put this back into the machine and continue on down the way. I'm going to continue doing this for all of my corners all the way around the quilt. So let's put this right back in. So right here, I'm about 6 inches away from finishing off my strip here. What I'm going to do is give it just a little back stitch, nothing crazy. Then I'm going to pull it out of the machine, and now it's time to connect both of these ends. Now, there's a zillion videos out there about how to connect these ends, but I'm going to show you, or try to show you, the simplest way of doing this. All you need, though, is a pin and a pair of scissors, okay? So let me grab my pin, and I can show you what we're going to do. So guys, this might be a little bit hard to see. I've got a pin here, okay? Now I'm going to stick this pin into my quilt somewhere where my two ends overlap. You want about a 2-inch overlap, so somewhere in between there. So I'm going to drop it right here. Now, there's a little trick to all this that has worked really, really well, is I'm going to drop my first one over the top here. I'm going to pull this one kind of out of the way, my other half. And what I'm going to do is, I know, since it's a 2.5-inch binding strip folded in half, that this binding strip is 1¼ inches, which is the perfect measurement for what we need. And I'm going to bring it over to my pin, and I'm going to line it up against my pin on top of my fabric. So pins here, I got my side of my strip here, which gives me my mark for my 1.25 inches. Now, another way to do this is that you can measure over 1/4 inch, or sorry, 1.25 inches away from your pin. That also works. Lots of different methods to do this, but essentially what we need is, we need to be 1.25 inches away from this pin here. Extra. Don't cut yourself short here, cut yourself extra. I'm going to just use this method on this side. I'll use the ruler method on the other side so you can see both sides. So I'm lining that up. I'm gonna pull out a pair of scissors. It's just my handy dandy pair of scissors. And I'm gonna cut it directly across. When I pull that off, I have my piece just like so. Now, the ruler method is very, very similar. I'm gonna move this out of the way. I'm gonna move this across here. I'm gonna put it on the pin 1 1/4 inch away. I'll do it this way so you guys can see what I'm doing. So I've got this lined up right here on my pin, 1 1/4 inch away. Again, extra, we want extra. Don't cut yourself towards the piece that's already sewn. You want to cut yourself extra. Take out my handy dandy pair of scissors here, and I'm going to cut off the extra. Now that I've cut these and it's in place and it looks great, now it's time to put them together. Now we're going to do exactly how we've done it in the past with that miter edge. Now, something to be mindful of is you want your right sides together. So essentially, best way to figure this out is I've got my edge here, the one that's my nice and pretty edge. You're going to open that up, and wherever that top crease is your nice side. If you're working with a print fabric, it makes it a lot easier. Solids can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to do the same thing to this side as well. I'm going to lay them down right sides together, just like so. And then you're going to sew directly across. Now, if you have any questions or if you're sewing it right, throw a pin in it in the angle that you think you're going to be sewing at. And if it opens up correctly, which mine does in this case, then you know that is the line you need to sew and the direction you need to be sewing. I'm going to leave my pin in it, move it on over to the sewing machine. And if the quilt fights you a little bit, unpick a little bit of your binding to give yourself some wiggle room. Gonna drop this inside of here. And guys, throw a mark in it, throw a pin in it, whatever you feel comfortable with to be able to get a really nice clean sew. I'll pull my pin out. And always double check this part, because once you cut it, it's gotta be perfect. So, as you can see here, it wants to lay down how we want it to lay down, which is beautiful. Now it's time to just trim that up and make it a little bit less bulky. I'm gonna just pull out the pair of scissors, open this up, and cut 1/4 inch away from that seam. Just like so. And then just to be a little bit extra here, I'm gonna put a nice hot iron on it just to flatten the whole thing down, which will complete the entire back portion of this quilt. And not only that, make it so much easier to sew the front on. So let me just iron this real quick, just to get it nice and flat. I'm going to sew up my last little strand here that isn't sewn. Now to finish off, make sure you add in that little back stitch there. So now the binding is attached to the back of this quilt. Pull out your iron, make sure it's hot, and we're gonna iron the binding over itself a little bit, making sure everything stays nice and flat. So, got this, I'm gonna bring it to here, and you're really gonna just push up on that binding. You're essentially taking out the stretch out of the binding. That way you can make sure you get a very consistent edge on the other side. When you reach those corners there, you just use the tip of your iron, kind of push them out. You don't have to fold them over yet. You can just push them right out. So people are going to ask, how am I ironing directly on my cutting mat? This has batting inside of it, and batting is what's inside your ironing board as well. If you haven't seen that video, make sure you check that out. So it's not going to damage my mat here. Obviously, This is a good quality mat and all that, so it's heat resistant as well, which helps a lot. You ruined my coffee table. You can already hear it. So now that we've ironed this, it just makes it so much easier and a cleaner fold over to the front. But all you're gonna do is kind of pull it over now towards the front side of your quilt. Pop your edges over as well. Do it this corner over here as well. So guys, now that we have this all turned, it's time to finish it off. Make sure all the finish work is done here. Now, the point in all this is trying to make it so that our seam or our stitching at the end is the least visible possible. So as we're stitching our top on, or our binding on, we want to just barely get it on the edge here, which helps hide the stitching a ton. On the back side, you want to come out just a little bit past where your seam is, which will hide it all into your backing. And if you stay really uniform, if you can see it, it looks like it's put there purposefully. So let's start on this, and you can start, since it's already done and bound essentially, you can start anywhere on the quilt to finish it off. And again, these are finished stitches. Take your time, make sure it looks nice, yada, yada, yada. And guys, I'm not using any special machinery. I'm not using any special foot. If you wanted to switch over to walking foot right now, you could. That will help some. But I like to use everything pretty traditionally. So I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to drop my foot on it. And again, you want to just sew the tiniest little bit of this. So guys, as I'm getting to the edge of this corner here, all you have to do is make sure that our next piece here is going to butt up perfectly in that miter, and it's going to look as if you hand bound this thing. So I'm going to bring this all the way over. I'm going to pull this over so that my points make a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to stitch right up until the point that I'm onto the new layer of fabric. So maybe one more stitch there. You're going to lift your presser foot up with your needle down, and you're going to turn this whole project over and continue on down sewing. So guys, again, take your time. We're almost at the last stretch here, so let's just finish this thing off. Now, when you get to the very last portion of it, it tends to want to kind of fold over itself. All you do is just pull it a little bit to get that fold out before you run over the same stitch line. Once you get there, do a quick back stitch, and that should finish off your machine binding. Now, machine binding is an absolute breeze to do compared to hand binding. This whole project took maybe 35 to 40-ish minutes to bind this whole thing. Now, if this was hand quilting or hand binding, you're looking at 2 to 3 hours. So it's a huge save in time. And come on, look at it. It is a beautiful binding. We hope that you liked this video, and if you did like the video, hit the like button. And if we get enough likes on this video, we'll do another different type of binding. One of my favorite bindings is faux flange binding. I'll show you guys how to do that if this video gets enough likes. So we hope you enjoyed. Make sure you check out our other videos, and we'll see you on the next one.